Alright, hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of From the Rails Up. This time it's all about brake rigging. Since we're sticking to one subject, hopefully this one won't be quite as long as the last one, but I'm in the early stages of recording this, so I don't really know. Also, before we get started, I'd like to preemptively apologize for the fact that I'm getting over a sinus infection, so if I sound like trash, that is why. Anyway, getting straight into it, what exactly is brake rigging? Well, brake rigging is the mechanical components between the pneumatic system and the wheels that actually allow the locomotive to apply its brakes. This video, we're not going to be talking about air systems because, as excited as I am to get into stuff like this is going to be probably several videos down the road before we get to this. So, that's coming, but not necessarily soon. Starting with the brake rigging basically consists of everything from the brake cylinder down to the wheels. These are all truck mounted components, and these are all the components that it uses in order to apply the brakes. Alright, so the first component we're going to talk about as far as brake rigging is the brake cylinder itself. This is where the air pressure is actually used to push into the brake rigging, which will actually apply the brakes. So what you're looking at here is an exploded view of all the parts inside of a brake cylinder. So starting on the left here, we have the actual housing, the actual cylinder itself. This is where you plumb the air into. All the other components hide out inside of here most of the time. The next thing we have here is the pancake seal, which is analogous to like a cup seal if you're familiar with hydraulic brakes. This seal, when you put pressure behind it, expands out and seals against the wall to actually allow the pressure to push on the piston. And behind that we have a felt ring. And all this felt ring is really here for is whenever you assemble everything, you'll put grease on the walls of the cylinder to lubricate everything. And we also spray this felt ring down with penetrating oil. And that ring will hold on to that lubricant and disperse it gradually as the piston moves back and forth along the cylinder wall. Speaking of the piston, that's the next component here. This is what actually takes the brunt of all the force and transfers it out down the brake rigging. Now the piston's going to have a tube on it, and around that tube there's going to be this return spring. This return spring is here to make sure that whenever the brakes are released and the air pressure is vented, the piston will actually move back down in the bore to where it started from, which will actually pull the brakes off of the wheels. It prevents the brakes from sitting there and dragging and causing issue and unnecessary wear. Then the next component out that we have here is the gland. I'm not 100% sure that's the actual name for this because railroads are special and use special names for a lot of things. But if you look at this analogous component on a hydraulic ram, it's called the gland. It's where the piston rod goes through. So I'm going to call it a gland. I don't know if that's right, but moving on. Gland, this is what the push tube goes through. This is what the return spring pushes against. This is what holds everything inside the cylinder. Past the gland, we have this collar, and this collar has two short little stubby bolts on the top and bottom that hold this collar to the end of the piston tube. And that is done so that whenever you assemble all this collar actually holds everything together. If you take this off, the piston return spring will push the piston and the gland apart. So as long as this collar is still on here, you can actually take the piston return spring and everything out of the brake cylinder and it'll stay together. Stuff doesn't go flying. That collar also has a retaining bolt in it that we'll get back to in a minute here. Next thing we have is the centering ring for the push rod, and we also have a packing ring for the push rod. The centering ring helps keep the push rod centered inside the piston tube, which prevents things from kinking or binding or doing weird stuff whenever we apply a bunch of force to it. And then the packing ring is solely here to keep weather out of this. You don't want dust, dirt, moisture, that kind of stuff to get down in this cylinder and cause things to rot and cause things to bind up and corrode. You don't want that. So we put this packing ring here to prevent a lot of that from happening. Then the last component we have here is the push rod itself. Now I mentioned hydraulic cylinders, and hydraulic cylinders often don't use push rods, so why do we use them here? Well, the body of the brake cylinder and thus everything else is going to be rigidly bolted and mounted to the truck frame, so it can't pivot or do anything funky like that. And the piston, as such, will only move in a straight line inside its bore. Now, this push rod connects the piston to the brake arm, which is the first component in the brake rigging, and you'll see in a minute when we get to it, the brake arm will pivot and it will make an arc whenever it moves. And that's a problem because the brake cylinder piston can only move in a straight line and the brake arm can only trace an arc, which causes issues. So we put this push rod in here to actually allow for a little bit of deviation from a straight line as that brake arm tries to trace out its arc. But anyway, looking at that exploded view, here is a view of what this would look like partially assembled. You can see we still have a brake cylinder body itself, and then now we have the pancake seal, the felt ring, and all that on the piston. We also have the piston and the piston return spring pushed through the gland with the collar bolted on. And you can also see now we have the packing ring and the centering ring put on the push rod. And then the last step would be to bolt, lubricate everything, and then you'll bolt the gland up to the brake cylinder housing itself. You'll push everything down inside of it. And then you'll put the push rod down in, and you got to make sure there's a hole through the push rod. You got to make sure that lines up with this retaining bolt that we talked about earlier. That retaining bolt is there so that when the piston return spring pushes everything back inside, that bolt, if the brake rigging for whatever reason doesn't want to move, that bolt will grab the push rod and pull it back in. And it also keeps the piston somewhat aligned, although that's not its main function. Its main function is to pull the push rod and the rest of the brake rigging back to its resting position whenever the brakes are released. So that's pretty much everything that actually goes on inside the brake cylinder itself. Now let's move on to the rest of the rigging, of which there are two basic types that we're going to get into. So speaking of the two types of brake rigging, the two basic categories you have are single shoe brakes, which would look something like this, or clasp brakes, which will look something like this. And because of course there are different versions of both of these, and that's how you end up with, I'm not monetized and not necessarily going to get there soon, but in the interest of breeding good habits, there are illegitimate children of both of these, and that's how you wind up with stuff like this, or like this, or like this. Seriously, EMD, what the heck is this? What? Anyway, moving on. We'll go through the parts of our brake rigging here, and we're going to start with the single shoe brake rigging. So the components you have of your single shoe brake rigging are, you can start with your brake cylinder, which we already talked about. Then you have the brake arm, the clevises, the live lever or the primary lever, the brake hangers, the brake shoe head, the brake shoe, and the brake key. You also have a brake guide on the outside of the lever, or a guide arm, on the outside of the lever. You have the slack adjuster connected to the bottom of it, and in some cases you'll have a dead lever or a secondary lever that also has a brake shoe, brake key, brake head, and guide arm connected to it. In this setup of brake rigging, the force comes from the brake cylinder, the brake arm pivots and changes the direction of motion, the live lever receives that force and presses this brake shoe against this wheel, and then there's also a force that goes to the other end of that lever and through the slack adjuster. Now, depending on the setup, it might go to a pin spot in the truck frame and that be the end of it, or in this case it goes to a dead lever, which is going to push the dead lever and thus this shoe against this wheel, and then the top of the dead lever is pinned against the truck frame. So as the brake cylinder pushes out, it forces these brake shoes apart and presses them into the corresponding wheels. And a couple things I want to note here are this guide arm. This guide arm goes over a brake guide that's connected to the truck frame that I didn't model here. We'll talk more about that whenever we actually get to truck frames, a couple of videos down the line. And so that guide arm just wraps over it and rubs against it. And the idea here is, remember, our wheels are tapered. So if you try and push these brake shoes into the wheel, they're going to tend to want to slide out and go off the edge of the wheel, which obviously we don't want to do. So we put this guide arm here and a guide bar on the truck frame to keep everything lined up with the wheel where it's supposed to be. We also have this brake key. You can see there's a gap inside the brake shoe, and brake key, when you put it in, has to go through that gap. If you look in here and you see that you missed this placement of the brake key, the brake shoe is probably going to just fall off. So whenever you put a shoe on, you want to make sure you get this key through the shoe itself. And in certain setups of brake rigging and in certain positions, yes, I'm looking straight at you, inside shoe on Alco trucks, it is a pain in the butt to make sure that this is done right. And also, while we're here in this area, the brake heads, or the brake shoe heads, these usually, when they're assembled, there's springs that I didn't model because I'm lazy, but there's springs that are tightened against this that kind of squeeze it against the live lever, and getting the tension on that is important to making sure everything operates correctly. Because if it's too loose, you can end up with a situation where when the brake's released, the head falls down and the top edge of the shoe will drag against the wheel. And all it does is just wear stuff out. It's not helpful for us. And if everything is made too tight, now the brake head won't pivot and follow the wheel, because as this shoe wears out, the live lever or the brake lever that it's attached to is going to have to pivot further and further and further and further. And if the head's locked in one position, now you're going to wear one side of the shoe more than the other. Or you could, worst case scenario, just break the shoe in half. I've seen it happen. Then the last thing I want to mention is the slack adjuster. The slack adjuster has a pin that goes in it and a bunch of holes that are drilled. And basically, if you move it half of the distance between the holes, you can get from this hole where this pin could go to this hole where this pin could go. So you have a fairly fine range of adjustment. Now, these usually will have a keeper. There's different setups for it, of course, but there'll be some kind of spring-loaded keeper that'll keep this pin held down in so it doesn't vibrate out, which I've seen happen. If that pin vibrates out, the slack adjuster, when you try to set your brakes, will just compress and you won't get a brake set, because once that brake cylinder piston hits the gland at the end of it, now instead of transferring force into the brake rigging, it's just pushing against the gland on the end of the cylinder. You don't actually get a brake set. So that's why they put those there, because it's very important that this pin stays in. And usually they also have a ring that goes through the head of it and a wire that's connected to the slack adjuster. And all that really does is, if the pin does somehow fall out, or if you pull it out while you're changing brake shoes or adjusting things, it doesn't just fall and roll away and disappear like your 10mm socket does. One more thing about brake heads. When you put these together, they are directional. I didn't model them that way because I'm lazy, but these brake heads are directional. Again, our wheels are tapered, so there's a taper machine into the brake head that holds the shoe at the correct angle for the taper of the wheel. If you put these in backwards or upside down, depending on the specific setup, you'll rub the back side of the wheel next to the flange, and the outside basically won't even touch the wheel. And that wears out brake shoes very, very fast because you have all that force coming into it, instead of being distributed evenly across the surface of it, is now being distributed just on the backside edge next to the flange. Causes the shoe to heat up, and that makes things brittle, and the shoes will crack and fall apart. Again, I've seen it happen, and it just is a bad thing all the way around. So these brake shoe heads, whenever you put them on, you need to make sure that they are facing the correct direction, because you can put them in wrong, and it does cause issues if you do. I actually think that's everything. So now we'll move on to clasp brakes. Alright, now here's 3 examples of a clasp brake setup. Obviously you wouldn't see anything in real life like this because all the shoes on one locomotive would be the same, but we're going to ignore that for now for illustrative purposes. So looking at this right away, you can see we have a lot of the same components. We still have the brake cylinder, brake arm, clevises, the live lever, the brake hangers. You have the brake head, the brake shoe, the brake key, and then we have the dead lever with its brake shoe, brake head, and brake key. And now when we get down here, this is the only thing that's really different. Instead of having a slack adjuster, these are called brake straps on this style of brake rigging. And then the brake straps also have integrated into them, in a way, the slack adjuster that's attached to the dead lever. Sometimes it's on the live lever, but usually they seem to put them on the dead lever. But this slack adjuster works the same way as the slack adjuster on the single shoe brakes. You just pull the pin out, slide it until the other hole lines up, put the pin back in, and then there's a spring-loaded cover to protect that pin from flying out. On these, again, the force is pretty similar too. Comes out of the brake cylinder, through the brake arm, through the clevis, down the live lever, which is going to swing the hangers and press this shoe against this wheel. Then it's going to go through the brake straps, down the slack adjuster pins, and then up the dead lever and press this shoe against this wheel. And then we get our brake set. So we get 2 shoes per wheel instead of just 1. And there are a couple of advantages to that. One, you're spreading the wear out across 2 shoes instead of just 1, so they last a little bit longer. You'll sometimes see clasp brakes used on like yard slugs for this reason. But, like I said before, they are kind of disappearing. And the main reason for that is the fact that the equipment is a lot more vulnerable and it's a pain in the butt to deal with. So I guess there's 2 reasons for it. First one about the equipment being more vulnerable has to do with derailments, particularly in yards. It's real easy to run through a switch and try and back up, or have a point break off, or have a sharp flange or something like that, and something decides to climb up the rail and then hit the dirt. Well, if you do that and the rail comes up right next to the wheel, then BAM! There goes your brake strap. Now you can't adjust your brakes, or they might not work at all. And that's a pain in the butt to deal with. The other thing that goes against these, or the other reason that they're kind of disappearing, is, like I said, maintenance. So we'll talk a little bit about this in the next video on combos. But if you need to replace this axle, you have to unhook the brake rigging, or at least the brake straps, and get it out of your way so you can drop the axle down out of the truck. If we go back and look at the single shoe brakes, all you have to do to get this axle down out of here is pull the pin out of the slack adjuster, and when you drop the axle, that brake shoe will move out of your way. It's a heck of a lot easier than fighting these, because I have never dealt with one of these that wasn't a pain in the backside to get loose. So that's the main reasons that these clasp brakes are kind of going away. You still see them in some situations, like I said, but a lot of railroads have pretty much gotten rid of them just because they get damaged really easily in the event of a derailment, and they're a pain in the butt, or they make truck maintenance a pain in the butt. I mentioned the 3 different types of brake shoes. Now, we'll get into this, like I said, when we get to actual air brakes. But different brake shoe setups use different brake cylinder pressures. That pressure depends on specific things. Like if you look over here, these yellow shoes, these are low friction shoes. Old school brake shoes were actually made out of just cast iron, which lasts a long time. And the other thing that was nice about them, particularly on yard engines, was that as your flange started to get tall, it would kind of cut it down for you. Because as you can see here, these shoes actually wrap around and go over the flange. But the flip side of that is the brake shoe. Just the shoe would weigh 75 pounds. And God forbid you drop that thing. They hurt and they were a pain in the butt. So they made these low friction composition shoes, or composite shoes, excuse me, that mimic the behavior of the cast iron but are a heck of a lot lighter. So that's what these yellow shoes are. But these will typically use an independent pressure right around 45 psi. And if we go over to this one, these are your standard composition or composite shoes, depending on who you ask. I've heard both of those used, to be honest with you. These, if you have one of them per wheel on the other side, that is typically a 72 pound or 72 psi full independent pressure. And depending again on specifics and specific setups, if you have two of them per wheel, it's going to be somewhere usually between 30 and 45, depending on the design of the brake rigging. Then we're also going to have over here, now if you notice these brake shoes, these are also composition shoes, but they're longer. These longer shoes use a full independent pressure of 32 psi. And so the differences in these pressures are why the brake cylinder equalizing line exists, and again we'll get into that down the line when we get into air brakes. But it's important that whenever you replace brake shoes, you replace them with the appropriate type of brake shoe. And looking at these long shoes, one thing that is actually nice about them is they have this nice deep window that's cut into it, and that window actually lets you know when you need to replace the brake shoe. If the shoe gets worn down to where you can't see through that window anymore, then it's time to replace the shoe. So, yeah, that's pretty much everything I think I wanted to say about the types of brake rigging. So now we get to go back and talk about our old friend the FRA again. Oh boy. Alright, I know last time the FRA section was very long, but fortunately when we're just talking about brake rigging, there's really only two parts that actually we have to deal with, and those two parts are 229.55, which is piston travel, and this part simply states that A, brake cylinder piston travel shall be sufficient to provide brake shoe clearance when the brakes are released. So whenever the brakes are released, there actually does have to be space between the shoe and the wheel so they don't sit there and rub. B, when the brakes are applied on a standing locomotive, the brake cylinder piston travel may not exceed 1 1/2 inches less than the total possible piston travel. The total possible piston travel for each locomotive shall be entered on the form FRA F6180-49A, which is also called your blue card, and it has to be in the cab of the locomotive. That has maintenance stuff on it and all kinds of stuff. But if you're ever not sure what your piston travel is, you can check that. Now, as your rule of thumb, pretty much any truck-mounted brake cylinder that I have ever seen has a maximum possible travel of 8 inches. So the maximum travel you're allowed is 6.5. And the reasoning behind this is pretty similar to if any of you guys are familiar with DOT rules for trucks. They're only allowed so much travel on their push rods whenever they set their brakes, because we don't want to exhaust that piston stroke. If the piston gets buried at the end of the cylinder, you don't get any force on your brakes, which is bad. So they put a safety buffer in there. Hey, you're only allowed to go to within 1.5 inches of your maximum piston travel. And the last bit of 229.55 is C. The minimum brake cylinder pressure shall be 30 pounds per square inch. This is talking if you sit there and apply your independent, the pressure in your brake cylinders has to be at least 30 psi. And some of the types of brake rigging come pretty close to that. Remember those long composition shoes had an independent pressure of 32 psi. So just above that. The other part we had was 229.57, which is a foundation brake gear. When that part simply states a lever, rod, brake beam, hanger, or pin may not be worn through more than 30% of its cross-sectional area, cracked, broken, or missing. All pins shall be secured in place with cotters, split keys, or nuts. Brake shoes shall be fastened with a brake shoe key and aligned in relation to the wheel to prevent localized thermal stress in the edge of the rim or flange. Now, a lot of this stuff gets dealt with whenever you tear down trucks and rebuild them. There's bushings that get replaced. They often get new pins. We inspect all the brake gear, all that kind of stuff. And the part about the brake shoes being aligned, this is why, this is another reason you want to make sure your brake shoe heads are on right and you want to make sure everything lines up. Because, yes, you want to avoid that localized heating on one edge of the wheel or the other. And if your brake shoe is on the wrong way, or if the brake rigging is worn out and it's not pressing against the wheel evenly, then you run into issues like this. It can cause shelling. If you get too much heat buildup in one part of the tread surface, it can cause it to shell out, and then we have problems. Now, one last thing I want to talk about that I actually couldn't find anywhere in the CFR. If anyone knows where I could find that, please let me know. And that has to do with brake shoe thickness. Just like on trucks, again, there's a minimum lining thickness you're allowed before the brakes are deemed unserviceable. I couldn't find anything about that in the CFR. However, if I pull up this picture of my flat spot gauge again, you can see we have these two square notches that are cut out. And one of these notches is 3/8 of an inch, and the other one is 1/2 of an inch. And I've been told that those are your minimums for composite shoes and cast iron shoes correspondingly. So 3/8 inch is the minimum lining thickness for a set of composite shoes, and 1/2 inch is the minimum lining thickness for cast iron shoes. In practice, I don't usually let them get that thin. As a matter of fact, this would be maybe a little bit thicker, but this is about the time when I start to change brake shoes, particularly on yard engines, because in yards they're relying way more on the brakes on the locomotive and less on the brakes on the cars, because a lot of the cars don't have air on them. I've seen locomotives come up with brake shoes that look like this, and I don't mean one or two, I mean all 12 brake shoes on a 6-axle locomotive came up, and this is pretty much what they all looked like. That was a little bit on the scary side, but we got them all changed out. We adjusted the piston travel and then sent it on its way. But this is bad. This is about the time they start changing. If they get much thinner than this, they should be changed. Now, I think that is everything I really wanted to say about brakes. But I did manage to put together a little animation for you guys, actually 2 of them, that shows all these components working. This actually took me quite a while to figure out how to rig it up and to figure out how to animate, but now that I've done it, hopefully it'll be easier for me to do this stuff with the stuff I really want to animate going forward. So, and I also recorded some audio for it for you guys, so, enjoy this, and then I've got something a little bit fun that I want to show you, and that'll be pretty much it for today. So, enjoy. Alright, now, one last thing before we close out here. I pretty recently here actually got to 9 subscribers, and I thought about doing something a little bit fun if I make it to 10. So some of the ideas I had were, I have a couple train-related games. If you guys wanted to see me play those for a little while and upload the video, I've got TRS-19, and I've got Derail Valley, which actually Derail Valley just released that Build 98 update. I actually haven't played that yet, so that might be a good one. But another idea I had was a little over a year ago, Heis, who, by the way, if you somehow found my channel and don't know he exists, I'd be impressed, but he does a lot of stuff with the Colorado Railroad Museum. He works with Steam, and he has a series called Railroad 101. If you like my content, I'd encourage you to check him out. He's way better at going over this stuff for, you know, a baby's first introduction to choo-choos type level than I am, but that's just because I work on these things and that's how my brain is. I like technical details. So I encourage you guys to check him out if you want some more basic overview type stuff for some of the stuff I talk about. But anyway, a little over a year ago, he did a video called Diesel 101. I had that thought come to me, go through, find some parts I could nitpick or correct. I'm sure he wouldn't mind anyway, because he admits you know, he didn't necessarily work on this stuff. He was the guy in charge of making sure stuff got done, not really the one in charge of doing it. But I had that thought come to me. So yeah, there's some ideas for you guys. If you guys have anything else you might like to see, let me know. But I'd like to do something nice for you guys for getting me to 10, which isn't a whole lot, but hey, it's nice. It's a start, right? We all got to start somewhere. So, yeah, that's really all I had. Thanks for watching, and in the next video, so this video we talked about what makes a train stop. Now in the next video, we're gonna talk about what makes it go, and that would be the traction motors. So, look forward to that here in however long it takes me to get that out. Thanks again for watching. Let me know what you'd like to see for my 10 sub special in the comments. And have a nice day. Thank you.